Welcome to Compact Mysteries from CompactHistories.com, the show where we try to unravel a different bite-sized mystery each week. From baffling disappearances and strange objects, to unexplained events and mysterious places. This is episode 75, The Mystery of the Pollock Twins. On the 7th of May 1957, the Pollock family suffered the kind of loss that does not simply alter a life, but splits it into before and after. In Hexham, Northumberland, 11-year-old Joanna Pollock and her 6-year-old sister Jacqueline were walking to church with a friend when a car mounted the pavement and struck them. The driver was later reported to have been in a disturbed state, having taken drugs before setting out. In a matter of seconds, an ordinary childhood walk became a national news story, and 3 children were dead. For John and Florence Pollock, grief settled over the family home like a second roof. Joanna and Jacqueline had been close, with the older sister naturally protective of the younger. Joanna was described as sociable, imaginative, fond of dressing up and performing little plays. Jacqueline was younger, more dependent, and still learning some of the small skills children usually master with time. These were not abstract losses. They were personalities, habits, voices, toys, favourite routines, and half-finished childhoods suddenly removed from the house. The tragedy was made even harder by the circumstances of the crash. It was not a mystery in the usual sense. There was no vanished suspect, no secret passage, no detective with a pipe, and an alarming tolerance for drafty rooms. The children had been killed in public, in daylight, in a terrible and apparently straightforward incident. Yet the mystery of the Pollock twins would not begin with the collision itself. It would begin afterwards. In the strange way, the dead seemed to remain present in the family's imagination. John Pollock had long held an interest in reincarnation, an unusual position within the Catholic setting of the family. He had wondered whether a soul might return, whether identity might survive death in some form, and whether proof of such a thing could ever be found. After the accident, those ideas became painfully personal. Florence, by contrast, did not share his certainty. She wanted to mourn her daughters, not turn their deaths into evidence of something beyond the grave. That difference mattered. The Pollock case would later be studied, debated, praised and criticised, partly because belief and grief were tangled together from the beginning. Before there were twins, before there were birthmarks, before there were childhood statements that unsettled everyone who heard them, there was a bereaved father convinced that death might not have been the end. Whether that made him unusually perceptive or dangerously suggestible depends very much on where one stands before the story begins. After the deaths of Joanna and Jacqueline, John Pollock became convinced that his daughters would return to the family. This was not a vague hope in the sentimental sense, the sort of thing people say when grief has taken the good chairs and refused to leave. According to later accounts, John believed specifically that the 2 dead girls would be reborn as twins. Florence did not accept this. She had lost 2 daughters and now had to live with a husband who seemed to be building a bridge between mourning and prophecy. When Florence became pregnant again, the tension sharpened. Medical opinion at the time reportedly suggested she was carrying 1 child, not 2. There was no known family history of twins to make the prediction seem likely. John's insistence that 2 girls were coming could therefore be read in 2 completely different ways. To believers, it was the first remarkable sign in the case. To sceptics, it was the first example of expectation shaping everything that followed. On the 4th of October 1958, Florence gave birth to twin girls. They were named Gillian and Jennifer. The timing alone was striking. Less than 18 months after Joanna and Jacqueline had been killed, 2 daughters had arrived in the same family, under circumstances that seemed to match John's prediction. It is easy to see why the story began to attract attention. Reincarnation cases are usually thought of as distant and exotic, tucked away in cultures where belief in rebirth is part of the furniture. Here, however, was a case in post-war Britain, in a Christian family, in a Northumberland town better known for Roman stones than returning souls. The first puzzle was not what the twins said, because babies are famously poor witnesses. They mostly specialise in noise, appetite and ruining clean clothing at strategic moments. The first puzzle was physical. Jennifer, the younger twin, was born with marks that appeared to echo features associated with Jacqueline. One mark was on her forehead, in a position said to resemble the scar Jacqueline had received as a young child. Another was on her waist, corresponding to a birthmark Jacqueline had had in life. This was where the Pollock case began to move from a grieving family story into something more difficult to dismiss. Birthmarks are common, of course. Children are not born as blank printer paper, although parents sometimes wish they came with clearer instructions. Yet the combination of timing, John's prediction, the twins' sex, and Jennifer's marks created a pattern that demanded some kind of explanation. Still, explanation is not the same as proof. A grieving father may notice similarities because he desperately needs them. A skeptical mother may still unconsciously preserve details of lost children in the household atmosphere. Families remember even when they claim they do not talk. But the Pollock twins had not yet begun to speak in ways that would trouble the adults around them. That came later, when toys long packed away were brought back into the light. The birthmarks became one of the most discussed parts of the Pollock case because they seemed to offer something more solid than memory. A child's statement can be misheard, shaped, repeated, encouraged, or embroidered over time. A mark on the skin is harder to explain away, although not impossible. In Jennifer's case, the reported marks appeared to connect her specifically with Jacqueline rather than Joanna, which made the case even more peculiar. These were identical twins, yet the signs were not identical. That detail later interested researchers because Gillian and Jennifer were found to be monozygotic twins, meaning they came from the same fertilized egg and shared the same genetic background. If one twin had marks that seemed to correspond to the earlier child and the other did not, the obvious explanation of ordinary heredity became less neat. Not impossible, because biology is a magnificent tangle and does not always behave like a tidy school diagram, but less neat. Jennifer's forehead mark was comparable to a scar Jacqueline had carried after an earlier childhood accident. She also had a mark on her waist similar to a birthmark Jacqueline had possessed. For John Pollock, this seemed like confirmation. For Florence, it must have been more complicated. She had not believed in reincarnation in the way John did, yet the new baby's appearance appeared to echo the daughter she had buried. One can only imagine the emotional strain of holding a living child while being reminded of a dead one. Birthmarks also played a wider role in the work of Dr. Ian Stevenson, the University of Virginia psychiatrist who later investigated the Pollock twins. Stevenson spent decades collecting cases in which young children claimed to remember previous lives, and he was particularly interested when bodily marks appeared to correspond to wounds, scars, or injuries associated with the deceased person the child seemed to recall. To his supporters, this made his work more than folklore. To his critics, it remained suggestive but far from conclusive. The Pollock case sat awkwardly between those positions. The marks were intriguing, but they were not laboratory evidence. They were observed inside a grieving family, connected to memories already charged with emotion. The resemblance depended partly on testimony, partly on interpretation, and partly on the willingness to accept that such correspondence might mean something. Yet the birthmarks mattered because they arrived before the twins could speak. They formed the opening act of the mystery, not its final proof. At first, the case could still be explained as coincidence sharpened by grief. Families see faces in clouds, patterns in dates, and meaning in small details because human beings are meaning-making machines with unreliable breaks. But when Gillian and Jennifer began to talk, the story moved into stranger territory. The marks on the body were followed by claims from the mind. When Gillian and Jennifer were around 3 years old, the Pollocks brought out toys that had belonged to Joanna and Jacqueline. These objects had reportedly been boxed away after the deaths, not left around as everyday reminders. According to the family, the twins identified particular toys as their own, and did so in a way that matched the ownership of the dead sisters. Gillian was associated with Joanna's toy, Jennifer with Jacqueline's. They also referred to the toys as Christmas gifts, which they had indeed been for the older girls. This is one of those details that gives the case its enduring pull. A birthmark can be a coincidence. A personality resemblance can be family imagination. But a child recognizing an old toy she supposedly has never seen before feels more pointed. It narrows the space available for shrugging. Not that shrugging becomes impossible, of course. Sceptics have very flexible shoulders. Other reported incidents added to the unease. Jennifer recognized a smock that Florence had once worn while helping with the family milk delivery business, even though it had apparently been put away before the twins were old enough to remember it. When asked how she knew about it, Jennifer connected it with her mother delivering milk. The twins were also said to have recognized places in Hexham after the family had moved away when they were still babies. On returning to the town, they reportedly knew the direction of a park and swings before seeing them. There were also remarks about school. When Florence suggested that the twins could have lunch at school, they allegedly replied that they had done so before. Gillian and Jennifer had not, but Joanna and Jacqueline had. Again, the mystery depends on how much weight one gives to family testimony. None of these moments was recorded in a controlled setting by an independent observer at the time. They were remembered and reported by parents who had suffered an almost unbearable loss. That does not make them false. It does mean caution is needed. A household is full of accidental information. Children overhear things adults never meant them to hear. They absorb tone, photographs, fragments of conversation and emotional reactions. A child may say something ambiguous, and an adult may unconsciously fit it into a larger story. Memory, especially family memory, is not a court stenographer. It is more like a novelist with a sentimental streak. Yet the Pollock twins' statements were not just vague claims of having been here before. They were linked to specific objects, places and routines from the lives of Joanna and Jacqueline. That specificity is why the case continued to interest Stevenson and others. The twins seemed for a few years to live in a house where two sets of childhoods overlapped, the one they were building and the one their parents thought had returned. The most emotionally disturbing reports in the Pollock case concerned the twins' apparent fear of cars and their play around the fatal accident. According to family accounts, Gillian and Jennifer sometimes spoke about the crash as though it were not a story from before their birth, but an experience with some lingering force. Florence reportedly once found Gillian cradling Jennifer's head while speaking of blood and the car striking her. For a parent who had already identified the bodies of two daughters, such a scene must have been almost impossible to process calmly. The twins were also said to show a strong fear of traffic. In one reported incident, when a car engine started nearby in a confined space, the girls became terrified and cried out as if the car were coming for them. This detail fitted a wider pattern that Stevenson often noted in his research. Young children who claimed past life memories sometimes displayed phobias connected to the manner in which the previous person had died. In the Pollock case, fear of cars made grim narrative sense. There were other behavioural similarities. Gillian reportedly resembled Joanna in being more mature, sociable, and inclined to guide her younger twin. Jennifer was more like Jacqueline, more dependent and childlike. The older pattern of Joanna mothering Jacqueline seemed, according to the family, to reappear in Gillian's treatment of Jennifer. Even small habits were noted, including the way Jennifer held a pencil upright in her fist while learning to write, a habit associated with Jacqueline before her death. This is where the case becomes both fascinating and slippery. Behavioural resemblance is compelling in a story, but difficult as evidence. Siblings often resemble one another. Parents interpret children through the lens of earlier children. A girl told, even indirectly, that she is like a dead sister may grow into that role without anyone consciously forcing her. Family systems can be subtle machines. They do not need villainy to produce strange outcomes, only grief, expectation, and repetition. Still, the twins' behaviour reportedly emerged when they were very young, and some of their statements faded as they grew older. That fading also matched patterns described in other cases studied by Stevenson, where children's claimed memories of previous lives often weakened around early school age. In the Pollock case, the unusual memories and behaviours were said to be strongest between roughly the ages of 3 and 7. By adulthood, Gillian and Jennifer were no longer children delivering uncanny lines in the family home. The vividness had faded, as childhood vividness tends to do. What remained was a case file, a set of remembered incidents, and a question that could not be settled by atmosphere alone. Were the twins expressing memories from another life, or were they reflecting the unresolved trauma of the family into which they had been born? Dr. Ian Stevenson investigated the Pollock case after it received public attention in the 1960s. He interviewed the family, examined the twins' birthmarks, and later continued to follow the case over many years. Stevenson did not approach such stories as campfire entertainment. He was a trained psychiatrist, and his method involved comparing children's statements with known facts, interviewing witnesses, and looking for alternative explanations. Whether one accepts his conclusions or not, he treated the subject with more seriousness than the average ghost-hunting television presenter waving a gadget in a cellar. For Stevenson, the Pollock twins were important because the case combined several elements he considered significant: physical marks, behavioural correspondences, apparent recognitions, phobias, and statements made by young children. It was also a Western case, not one emerging from a culture where reincarnation belief was widespread and socially expected. That made it harder, though not impossible, to dismiss as a product of cultural conditioning. But the criticisms are serious. The strongest evidence came largely from the parents, and John Pollock already believed in reincarnation before the twins were born. That does not mean he lied. It does mean he had a framework ready and waiting. The twins grew up in the same family that had lost Joanna and Jacqueline. They may have overheard names, stories, reactions, or fragments of grief. They may have seen photographs or sensed emotional cues. Even without direct coaching, children are excellent collectors of family secrets, usually while pretending not to know where their shoes are. There is also the problem of memory after the fact. The Pollock story was reconstructed through testimony, and testimony can shift. A remark that seemed odd at the time may become more meaningful later. A coincidence may be remembered because it fits the pattern, while dozens of non-coincidences quietly vanish. This is not deception. It is simply how human memory behaves when it has been asked to carry too much emotional weight. And yet the case refuses to disappear. It endures because neither side can claim total victory. Reincarnation is not proven by the Pollock twins. The evidence is too personal, too dependent on family reporting, and too difficult to test. But skeptical explanations also leave awkward pieces on the table: the timing of the twin birth, Jennifer's marks, the toy recognitions, the reported fear of cars, and the way the memories faded with age. Perhaps the deepest mystery is not whether Joanna and Jacqueline literally returned as Gillian and Jennifer. It may be how identity is shaped by love, loss, memory, and expectation. The Pollock twins stand at the unsettling edge between grief and possibility. Their story asks whether the dead can return, or whether the living, in trying to survive loss, sometimes rebuild the dead so vividly that they seem to breathe again. That brings us to the end of this episode of Compact Mysteries, part of the Compact Histories Network. If you enjoyed it, please follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss any future episodes, and consider leaving a rating or review, as it really helps new listeners find the show. You can find more episodes at compactmysteries.com, where you can also explore our other podcasts covering biographies, history, disasters, warfare, and true crime. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest. Finally, please consider supporting the show directly by buying us a coffee. Head on over to compacthistories.com/mysteriescoffee to see how. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.